London, February 1685. The winter air is thick with the stench of coal, smoke, and fear. Inside Whitehall Palace, the most powerful man in England is dying. Charles II, the merry monarch, the ruler who brought laughter back to a nation, lies sprawled on a velvet-covered bed, his once vigorous frame racked with convulsions. His skin burns with fever, his lips are cracked. His breath comes in shallow gasps. His courtiers hover in the shadows, speaking in hushed tones, while the royal physicians swarm like frantic bees, armed with the most dangerous arsenal 17th-century medicine can provide. They bleed him, they blister him, they force potions of crushed pearls and exotic herbs down his throat. They smear his body with ointments laced with mercury, the metal slowly poisoning his blood. They even crack open a hot coal brazier in the chamber to draw out the sickness, the smoke curling around the bed like a death shroud. None of it works. In fact, every desperate remedy only makes him worse. Outside the palace gates, London hums with gossip. Some say the king has been poisoned by the French, by Parliament, by his own Catholic brother. Others whisper that it's divine punishment, long overdue for a lifetime of sins. The streets are crowded with beggars, thieves, and merchants, all hungry for scraps of news from within the royal bedchamber. And somewhere in the city's taverns, there are those who raise a cup to the idea that England may soon have a new king. Charles's mind drifts in and out of consciousness. His black, expressive eyes that once charmed courtiers and commoners alike, now dart from shadow to shadow, as if searching for someone he knows he will never see again. In his fevered state, he remembers faces. His father, King Charles I, stepping up to the scaffold on that bitter January morning. His mother, Henrietta Maria, fleeing into exile. The lovers, the traitors, the ministers who once swore loyalty and then betrayed him. It is a cruel irony. Charles was a survivor, a man who had endured civil war, exile, and political disaster. He had outmaneuvered Parliament, dodged assassination plots, and charmed his enemies into becoming allies. Yet here he was, powerless against the slow, inexorable collapse of his own body. The royal court is a theatre of denial. Ministers stride the corridors with forced smiles, assuring foreign ambassadors that the king will recover. Servants polish silver and stoke fires as if routine could hold death at bay. But in the private moments, behind locked doors, they speak the truth. England may be only hours away from losing its monarch. Then, a new rumour begins to circulate among the inner circle, one that no one dares to speak too loudly. Charles is not just sick. He is being helped toward his end, perhaps by poison, slipped into his chocolate or wine, perhaps by the very cures his doctors administer so liberally. After all, if Charles were to die, his brother James would take the throne, a Catholic king in a Protestant land, a change that could throw the kingdom into chaos. For some, that chaos would be an opportunity. The king's chamber is stifling. Curtains are drawn tight against the cold, trapping the sour scent of sweat and medicine. The rhythmic tick of the clock seems to grow louder with every second. Priests stand ready, their faces pale, waiting for the moment when the crown will pass from one head to another. But as the fever rages, Charles's mind turns not to politics, but to the moment his fate was set in motion. He was not just a king by accident of birth. He was a king born under a shadow, in a country already sliding toward war, a boy whose life would be shaped by blood, betrayal, and the unshakable knowledge that his throne was never truly secure. It is in this haze of pain and memory that the story of Charles II truly begins, not in this darkened room where his life is ebbing away, but in another, brighter chamber, more than half a century earlier, when a newborn prince was placed in his mother's arms, a prince whose birth was celebrated with feasts and music, and whose future, though wrapped in silk, was already stained with the scent of gunpowder. As the king's body trembles under the weight of another convulsion, a figure slips quietly from the room, disappearing into the cold London night. Whether they carry news or a deadly secret, no one can say. And above the city, The bells of St. Paul's stand silent, waiting for the moment they will toll. May 29, 1630. St. James's Palace in London is alive with celebration. Bonfires crackle in the streets, bells peal across the city. Courtiers, nobles, and foreign ambassadors crowd into the great halls, raising goblets of wine in honour of the birth of a son to King Charles I and his French-born queen Henrietta Maria. The boy is christened Charles, after his father. He is the long-awaited male heir, a living promise that the Stuart line will continue. In that moment, wrapped in silks and lying in his mother's arms, he seems destined for a life of unquestioned power and privilege. But from the very hour of his birth, shadows gather over his cradle. His mother, Henrietta Maria, is a Catholic, a faith that many in Protestant England despise and fear. To Puritans and political hardliners, she represents the threat of popish influence at court, a Trojan horse smuggling Rome's power into the heart of the kingdom. Even as Londoners cheer for the newborn prince, others mutter in taverns and market stalls that this child will grow up under dangerous foreign ideas. His father, King Charles I, is no less divisive. Proud, reserved, and fiercely committed to the divine right of kings, Charles I believes that his authority comes directly from God, not from Parliament, not from the people. In an age when political thought is beginning to tilt toward shared governance, his stubbornness is like dry tinder waiting for a spark. But young Charles knows nothing of this. As a child, he is bright, inquisitive, and quick to charm. He grows up in the glittering world of the Stuart court, surrounded by tapestries, music, and the scent of fresh wax on polished floors. He watches court masques, where nobles in elaborate costumes dance and speak poetry, their faces half hidden by jewelled masks. He plays with miniature cannons and soldiers, toys that foreshadow the grim reality that will one day define his life. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom simmers. Parliament is restless, pushing back against the king's attempts to rule without its consent. Religious tensions boil. Puritans rail against what they see as creeping Catholicism, while royalist clergy defend the grandeur of the Anglican Church. Taxes rise. Discontent spreads. By the time Charles is 7, that discontent has taken on a sharper edge. His father's decision to dissolve Parliament entirely, to rule without it for 11 years, fuels accusations of tyranny. The streets are thick with pamphlets, each one sharper than a sword, accusing the king of selling England's soul. Charles sees glimpses of this unrest in the wary glances of servants, in the way soldiers at the palace gates shift uneasily in their armour. Sometimes, walking in the gardens with his nurse, he hears shouts from beyond the walls, protests carried on the wind. And then, in 1640, the storm breaks. The bishops' wars with Scotland erupt over religious reforms, forcing King Charles I to recall Parliament to raise funds. It is a move born of necessity, but it unleashes years of pent-up fury. Arguments between king and Parliament grow bitter and personal, each side convinced the other is a threat to England's future. Young Charles is now 10, old enough to sense the danger. He begins to see less of his father, who spends long hours in council chambers, emerging with a face like carved stone. His mother grows more anxious, her letters to relatives in France taking on a desperate tone. And yet, there are still moments of innocence. Charles rides horses in the royal mews, races his siblings through palace corridors, and listens wide-eyed to tales of his family's ancestors, kings who fought in battles, won crowns, and bent entire nations to their will. It is in these moments that he begins to imagine himself as one of them. A ruler, a warrior, a man born to command. He does not yet understand that before he can wear a crown, he will have to survive the fire that is coming. By 1642, the tension between Crown and Parliament snaps. The king, in a disastrous move, attempts to arrest 5 members of the House of Commons. London explodes in outrage. Riots fill the streets, and Parliament begins raising an army. The country fractures, neighbours turn against each other, families split along political lines. The English Civil War has begun. In the cold halls of St. James's Charles II, not yet 12 years old, listens as servants whisper about troop movements and battles. His father rides off to war, leaving the boy in the care of loyalists. The music of his childhood is drowned out by the drumbeat of rebellion, and somewhere deep inside, Charles begins to realize the truth. The crown he is meant to inherit is not a treasure waiting for him to claim. It is a prize that must be fought for, bled for, and perhaps one that could cost him his life. The year is 1642, and England is at war with itself. On one side stand the royalists, loyal to King Charles I and the divine right of kings. On the other, the parliamentarians, led by men who believe that the king's power must be bound by law. The nation becomes a battlefield, each victory and defeat tipping the scales of history. For young Charles, now entering his 12th year, the world shifts from the ceremonial rhythms of court life to the grim urgency of survival. The silks and pageantry of St. James's are replaced by the smell of damp tents, the clank of armour, and the low, urgent tones of military councils. He rides with the king's forces at times not into the heart of battle, but close enough to smell the smoke and hear the screams. His father, King Charles I, is a distant but looming figure, dignified, stubborn, certain of his rightness. In private moments, the king speaks to his son not as a child, but as a future monarch, drilling into him the importance of honour, loyalty, and God's will. These are lessons Charles will remember, though not always follow, for the rest of his life. The war grinds on, year after year. Royalist victories at Edgehill and elsewhere raise hopes, but they are fleeting. Parliament's forces grow more disciplined under the command of men like Oliver Cromwell. The new model army professional, relentless, begins to dominate the field. By 1645, the tide has turned decisively against the king. Royalist strongholds fall one by one. Charles II, now 15, is sent to the relative safety of Jersey in the Channel Islands. There, he receives letters from his father, their tone shifting from paternal pride to a sombre recognition that the end may be near. In 1646, the war is effectively lost. The king surrenders to the Scots, hoping for more favourable terms than Parliament would offer. Instead, he becomes a bargaining chip. The Scots hand him over to Parliament in exchange for payment. For the young prince, this is a crushing blow. His father, the man who seemed unshakable, now a prisoner. The next 2 years are a blur of failed negotiations, uprisings, and political manoeuvring. Charles II remains in exile, first in Jersey, then in France with his mother. He lives among courtiers who cling to their titles but have no power, men and women who sip wine in borrowed salons while dreaming of the court they once knew. Then, in January 1649, the unthinkable happens. King Charles I is put on trial for treason against his own people, a charge so unprecedented that it shakes the foundations of monarchy itself. The trial is a formality. His guilt is a foregone conclusion. On the morning of the 30th of January, the king walks to the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. It is bitterly cold, the sky pale and still. He wears 2 shirts so that he will not shiver from the chill and be mistaken for a man afraid. Before the crowd, he declares that he dies, the King of England, and that he forgives his enemies. Then, with a single swing of the executioner's axe, his head is severed. A groan ripples through the onlookers. News of the execution reaches Charles II in France. He is only 18 years old. The monarchy is abolished, replaced by the English Commonwealth under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. To royalists across Europe, the event is nothing less than regicide, the murder of a king. To the parliamentarians, it is justice. Charles does not have the luxury of mourning in peace. Within days, royalist leaders in Scotland proclaim him King Charles II of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But it is a hollow title. He has no throne, no treasury, and no army capable of matching Cromwell's. Worse, his very life is now a target for assassins and bounty hunters, eager to claim the reward Parliament offers for his capture. In 1650, Charles makes his most daring gamble yet. He travels to Scotland to accept the crown there. agreeing to strict conditions imposed by the Presbyterian Kirk. It is a marriage of convenience. They see him as a tool to restore their influence, while he sees them as his only path back to England. That path, however, leads to disaster. In September 1651, Charles marches south with a Scottish army, hoping to rally English royalists to his cause. Instead, at Worcester, Cromwell's forces crush them in a decisive battle. The royalists are slaughtered. Charles barely escapes with his life. What follows becomes one of the most famous episodes in royal history. The hunted king, disguised as a humble servant, hides in an oak tree while parliamentarian soldiers search below. For 6 weeks, he evades capture, moving from safe house to safe house, aided by loyal subjects who risk execution for helping him. The experience will shape him forever. He learns to rely on wit, charm, and calculated deception as much as on armies. When he finally reaches the safety of France once more, Charles is 21 years old. He has been proclaimed king, crowned in name, hunted like an animal, and stripped of his country. He is, in truth, a king without a throne. And worse, he has no idea how long he will have to live this way. France should have been a refuge for Charles, but in reality, it was a gilded prison. The French court of his cousin, Louis XIV, was a place of dazzling luxury and suffocating politics. There were jewels, feasts, and ballets, but no real power for the exiled King of England. Charles was a royal guest, yes, but also a political pawn to be moved or discarded whenever it suited French interests. Money was his constant enemy. The English crown jewels, the great estates, the royal revenues, all had been seized by Cromwell's government. Charles lived off the charity of foreign courts, moving between France, the Netherlands, and Spain, always with a train of loyal but impoverished royalists in tow. Some sold their family heirlooms just to buy food. Charles himself was forced to pawn his mother's jewellery more than once to keep his small household alive. In these years, Charles learned to survive, not by force, but by charm. He cultivated a reputation as a man of wit and easy conversation. He danced well, laughed often, and made himself the kind of guest people liked to keep around. But beneath that smooth exterior, he never forgot the humiliation of being a king in name. Only a man who must bow to the whims of others just to have a roof over his head. Exile had another cruelty: betrayal. Not all who called themselves loyalists were true. Cromwell's agents moved like shadows through Europe, bribing, blackmailing, and turning some of Charles's closest companions. Twice, escape routes were compromised. More than once, planned uprisings in England failed because someone within Charles's own circle had sold the details to the enemy. Worse still was the betrayal of friends for personal gain. Men who had once fought alongside his father now cozied up to Cromwell's government in exchange for titles or land. Each defection was a knife in Charles's ribs, a reminder that loyalty could not be bought, but it could be sold. Still, he tried to play the game. He made overtures to Catholic Spain. Even though such alliances alienated his Protestant supporters, he courted favour with Louis XIV, offering promises of friendship that were worth little without an army to back them. He learned to smile at men he despised, to nod politely at suggestions he would never follow. It was the art of survival, and Charles mastered it because he had no choice. Yet for all his adaptability, exile wore him down. He spent nearly a decade as a wandering sovereign, his court moving from rented palace to borrowed estate. Every year that passed made his return to England seem less likely. Cromwell's regime was strong, the English navy was powerful, and the people, so far as he could tell, had learned to live without a king. But even in the darkest days, Charles clung to one truth: political fortunes change. Nothing in England's stormy history ever stayed the same for long. Somewhere, somehow, the tide would turn. That turn began with an event he could never have predicted: the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658. The iron-willed Lord Protector had kept the English Commonwealth intact through sheer force of will, but his passing left a vacuum no one could truly fill. His son, Richard Cromwell, was weak and indecisive, unable to control the army or parliament. Factions began to form, old grudges resurfaced. The republic that had executed a king started to crumble from within. Charles watched all of this from abroad, careful not to move too soon. He had been burned before by false hopes. But this time, the cracks in the English government were widening faster than anyone expected. The army clashed with Parliament. Royalist sympathies began to stir in the country. And then came the whisper from London that would change everything. Influential figures in Parliament were quietly discussing the possibility of restoring the monarchy. After nearly a decade in exile, Charles could feel the balance shifting. The question was no longer whether he could reclaim his throne, but how much of himself he would have to trade away to do it. By early 1660, the English Commonwealth was in chaos. Parliament had dissolved and reformed itself so many times that ordinary people could barely keep track of who was in charge. The army, once the iron backbone of Cromwell's regime, was fractured by infighting and unpaid wages. The streets of London hummed with rumours, each wilder than the last, that Cromwell's ghost haunted Whitehall, that France was preparing to invade, that God himself had turned his back on the Republic. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that a man named General George Monk emerged as the unlikely power broker. Monk had been a loyal Cromwellian commander, but he was a pragmatist before all else. He could see that the Republic was rotting from within, and he understood something few dared to say aloud. England needed a figurehead who could unite it, and there was only one man who fit that description, the exiled Charles Stuart. In February 1660, Monk marched his troops to London, dissolved what remained of the so-called Rump Parliament, and called for fresh elections. The new Parliament, known as the Convention Parliament, wasted little time opening secret channels to Charles in the Netherlands. What followed was a delicate negotiation, the Declaration of Breda. In that document, Charles made promises that would secure his path back to power. He pledged a general amnesty for his former enemies, religious tolerance within limits, and respect for Parliament's authority. These were not easy concessions for a man raised to believe in the divine right of kings. But Charles understood. This was no longer the 1632nd. The monarchy could not be restored in its old, absolute form. If he wanted the throne, he would have to share it. The gamble paid off. On May 8, 1660, Parliament officially declared Charles II the lawful King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. His restoration was to be peaceful, a rare miracle in a century drenched in blood. When Charles landed at Dover on May 25, the scene was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The shoreline was packed with thousands of cheering subjects, their shouts echoing over the waves. Church bells rang from every steeple. Bonfires blazed in towns across the realm. For years, parliamentarian propaganda had painted him as a frivolous, dangerous exile. Now, he was the saviour returning to heal the nation's wounds. As he rode into London on May 29, his 30th birthday, the city exploded in celebration. Streets were carpeted with flowers. Banners bearing the royal crest fluttered from windows. People wept openly at the sight of their king. It was as if the entire country had decided to forget the civil war, the regicide, the years of bitter division. But Charles knew better than to believe in this sudden unity. Beneath the cheering lay deep fractures between royalists and republicans, Anglicans and Puritans, Protestants and Catholics. He also knew that many of those now praising him had once signed his father's death warrant or fought against him on the battlefield. Their loyalty was a performance, and performances could change with the next act. Still, he played his part. He smiled, waved, and projected the image of a forgiving, pleasure-loving monarch, a stark contrast to the grim austerity of the Puritan regime. He reopened the theatres, banned under Cromwell. He allowed music and dancing back into public life. He gave England permission to laugh again, earning the nickname the Merry Monarch. Yet in private, Charles was anything but careless. Every move he made was calculated. He rewarded loyalists, but not so lavishly as to provoke envy. He kept his political enemies close, often dining with men who had once plotted his downfall. And he never forgot the lesson of Worcester, that survival depended on knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. The Restoration was a victory, yes, But it was also a compromise. Charles had regained his throne, but not the absolute power his father had died defending. He ruled by the grace of Parliament, and he understood that if he pushed too far, they could strip the crown from his head as swiftly as they had placed it there. In the candlelit halls of Whitehall, amid the music and laughter of his restored court, Charles could feel the tension humming beneath the surface. England was smiling at him now, but smiles, he knew, could turn into snarls overnight. And soon, events far beyond his control would test whether the merry monarch's charm could hold a fractured kingdom together, or whether it would all come crashing down in fire and plague. The first years of Charles II's reign were a carnival compared to the grim greyness of Cromwell's rule. Theatres reopened, taverns flourished, and fashions exploded in colour. After 2 decades of political and religious severity, England was ready to indulge, and Charles led by example. His court was a whirl of music, masquerade balls, and whispered intrigues in shadowed corridors. Playwrights like William Wycherley and John Dryden thrived, filling the stages with sharp-tongued comedies and daring romances. Painters captured the new royal mistresses in silks and pearls, their beauty becoming as much a part of court politics as treaties and trade. Charles himself moved easily between official audiences and private chambers, charming ambassadors 1 hour and slipping into a lover's arms the next. To the public, he became the merry monarch, a man of laughter and tolerance, easy to approach, generous with his presence. But that was only half the truth. Beneath the charm was a survivor who never forgot the years spent hunted and penniless. He knew how quickly power could vanish. Every smile was calculated, every gesture measured to keep enemies close and allies closer. The balancing act was delicate. Parliament still held the purse strings, and its members ranged from loyal royalists to former Cromwellians who viewed him with suspicion. Religious tension was an even sharper blade. Charles's personal leanings were toward Catholicism, a dangerous preference in a Protestant nation, but he concealed them behind the Anglican facade, carefully avoiding open confrontation while quietly shielding Catholics when he could. Then came the disasters that would define his reign. In 1665, the plague returned to London with a vengeance. It began in the rat-infested docks and spread like wildfire through the crowded city. Within months, the death toll climbed into the tens of thousands. Houses were boarded up with their sick still inside. The sound of cartwheels at night meant the dead were being carried to the pits. Fear stalked every street. Charles did what few rulers would have dared. He stayed in London for as long as possible. While many fled to the countryside, he walked the city's emptying streets, speaking with magistrates, encouraging efforts to contain the disease. His presence didn't stop the dying, but it gave the survivors something rare, a sense that their king would not abandon them. No sooner had the plague begun to ebb than a new catastrophe struck. On the 2nd of September, 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Fanned by strong winds, it roared through London for 4 days, devouring churches, homes, and entire markets. The city's wooden heart turned to ash. Over 13,000 houses were destroyed. Tens of thousands were left homeless. Once again, Charles refused to hide. He rode through the burning streets with buckets in his own hands, organizing firefighting efforts, giving orders to create firebreaks. Witnesses recalled the sight of their king, his face blackened with soot, shouting for men to tear down buildings to stop the flames. It was dangerous, exhausting work, and it transformed him in the eyes of many Londoners from a figure of pleasure into a king of action. But for all the goodwill he earned, the disasters also deepened England's fractures. The destruction of the fire fed paranoia. Foreigners and Catholics were accused of arson. Old hatreds flared. Parliament began to watch Charles more closely, suspicious of his foreign alliances and the influence of his Catholic brother, James, Duke of York. Charles understood the danger. He could not afford to alienate Parliament, yet he also could not completely sever ties with the Catholic powers of Europe, not when France, in particular, had the money and influence he might one day need again. So he wore his mask, the smiling, joking, wine-drinking king, the man who danced in the great halls and told bawdy stories in private, the monarch who gave England permission to breathe after years of suffocation while behind the laughter. He plotted, calculated, and waited for the next storm. And that storm was already gathering in the shadows. It would not come as fire or plague, but as whispers, a tangle of lies, paranoia, and political theatre that would push Charles's reign into a darker, deadlier phase. By the late 1672, Charles II had been on the throne for nearly 2 decades. He had survived war, plague, and fire. But the real danger now came not from foreign armies or acts of God. It came from the whispers in Parliament, the murmurs in taverns, and the pamphlets passed from hand to hand in the dark. The trouble began with what would become known as the Popish plot, a lie so skillfully told that it drove England into a frenzy. In 1678, a man named Titus Oates, a disgraced clergyman with a gift for invention, claimed to have uncovered a vast Catholic conspiracy to assassinate the king and place his Catholic brother, James, Duke of York, on the throne. Oates' tale was absurd, filled with wild accusations, invented meetings, and secret letters that never existed, but it was perfectly timed. Anti-Catholic sentiment was already running high, and England was ready to believe the worst. Parliament erupted, the streets filled with paranoia. Ordinary Catholics were harassed, arrested, even murdered. Dozens of men were tried and executed on the flimsiest evidence, their deaths cheered by crowds convinced they were saving the kingdom. Charles himself knew the plot was fiction he saw through Oates's lies early on, but opposing it openly risked inflaming the mob. So, he played for time, shielding some accused men where he could while allowing others to face the scaffold, hoping to bleed the hysteria out before it turned on him directly. But the Popish plot had a far more dangerous consequence. It threw a spotlight on James, the king's heir. James's Catholic faith was no secret, and now Parliament began to debate whether he should be barred from succession altogether. The movement became known as the Exclusion Crisis. In the House of Commons, speeches thundered about the dangers of a Catholic monarch. Pamphleteers painted James as an English tyrant in waiting, a puppet of the Pope. Outside Westminster, riots broke out, bonfires roared, and effigies of the Pope were burned in the streets. Charles faced an impossible choice. If he yielded to Parliament and excluded his brother, he would weaken the crown and embolden those who believed they could dictate royal succession. If he stood by James, he risked pushing the country toward rebellion. True to his nature, Charles chose the path of patience and manipulation. He dissolved Parliament not once, but 3 times, refusing to give it the chance to pass the Exclusion Bill. He quietly secured financial support from Louis XIV of France, ensuring he could govern without parliamentary subsidies if necessary. It was a dangerous bargain. Taking French gold would only fuel suspicion about his loyalties, but it gave him breathing room. And yet, the atmosphere in England was poisonous. Plots, both real and imagined, seemed to multiply in the shadows. Some were the work of desperate royalists or fanatical republicans. Others were fabrications designed to destroy political enemies. Assassination rumours swirled. Charles's movements were watched closely by those who claimed to protect him, but might well be planning his end. In public, the king remained the merry monarch laughing at plays, walking his dogs in St. James's Park, slipping into the beds of his mistresses. In private he was wary, even cold, measuring every word, keeping his true thoughts locked behind an easy smile. He had learned long ago that in politics, as in exile, survival was an art. But the enemies in the shadows were patient too, and when the final act came, it would arrive not as an armed rebellion or a treacherous blade in the night, but as something far more relentless, the slow, merciless decay of his own body. The 1st of February, 1685. Charles II rose that morning in seemingly good health. He attended council, joked with courtiers, and even spent time with his beloved dogs. But as the day wore on, something changed. He complained of feeling faint. Moments later, he collapsed in a violent fit. Witnesses said his face turned a ghastly shade of blue, his eyes rolling back as he was carried to his bedchamber. The king's physicians descended like vultures. They bled him of over a pint of blood in the first hour alone. They made him swallow boiling brews of powdered herbs, antimony, and crushed pearls. They applied blistering agents to his skin, rubbed mercury ointment into his chest, and forced him to drink enemas of brandy and herbs. Each treatment only made him worse. His head ached, his stomach churned, and his skin broke into sores. His hair began to fall out in clumps. Outside the palace, the rumours spread faster than the illness. Was he poisoned by Catholic agents eager to see James on the throne? Was it Protestant plotters who feared Charles's secret leanings toward Rome? Or was this simply nature claiming a man whose life had been lived at full speed? A man who had indulged in rich food, strong drink, and endless nights of pleasure. As the days dragged on, Charles drifted in and out of consciousness. Courtiers and mistresses wept at his bedside. Ministers whispered about succession. Priests waited in the shadows. Finally, in the early hours of the 6th of February, the king summoned enough strength to make a final request that they be kind to his brother James. And then, in a gesture that shocked many, he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, perhaps the most closely guarded secret of his life. Moments later, the merry monarch was gone. London mourned, though the grief was mixed with uncertainty. The man who had restored the crown had left behind a kingdom still divided, its future uncertain under a Catholic king. His reign had been a tapestry of contradictions, pleasure and pragmatism, charm and calculation, survival at all costs. For Charles II, the throne had never been a gift. It had been a prize, wrestled from the jaws of defeat, defended not just with armies, but with wit, cunning, and an unshakable will to endure. He had been born to rule, yes, but also born to suffer. And perhaps that is the truest measure of his legacy. Not that he wore the crown, but that he kept it, in an age when kings were losing their heads. If you found this story as haunting as it is fascinating, there's a whole world of forgotten history, just like it filled with betrayal, survival, and the hidden truths behind the people we think we know. Subscribe for more dark history brought to life. And join me next time as we uncover another chapter the history books would rather you forget. Until then, keep your eyes on the shadows. History hides there,